I am Dr. Sandra Hernandez from the Child Protection Network, and our lecture for this afternoon is on OSAEC definitions and terminologies. Okay, so to start, as you may know from the Ako Para sa Bata conference last year, OSAEC was our theme, and we are beginning to include OSAEC in our database in the WCPMIS already. But even for me and for most of us, the terminologies may be confusing. We are very familiar already with offline child sexual abuse, but the context of OSAEC, the terms, and the new terminologies may be confusing. So we decided to give this lecture to clarify some of the terms that you might be encountering already. So to start, I hope you are all still there. There are 64 participants. So as WCPUs, we often encounter patients who are victims of offline child sexual abuse. But with the new revised protocol for case management of victims of abuse, neglect, exploitation, and discrimination, which has been updated to include OSAEC, the WCPUs may really see cases already that involve some form of online child sexual abuse. We also know that RA 11930, which lapsed into law in 2022, already gives us a list of the acts that are penalized or criminalized. So previously, we had anti-child pornography, we had anti-trafficking law, but this time with the anti-OSAEC and CSAM law, live streaming or streaming of sexual content involving children is already specifically mentioned in this law, including engaging in luring or grooming of a child. So we need to be aware, if we can review this law, which acts are specifically considered unlawful and prohibited. When you look at the list, it says any form of OSAEC and CSAM. And then the law also lists the definitions according to the Republic Act of what is considered OSAEC and CSAM. But then we still need to understand the terminologies behind this Republic Act. So in last year's conference, selected WCPUs participated in a workshop where we went through several scenarios as the participants encounter these cases. And then we also tried to develop screening questions. But then again, before we can recognize, we need to understand first the terminologies. Okay. I will go through the cases later, but the outline for this presentation is to go through the terms, the subtypes, and then we will discuss the intersection of offline and online victimization and some of the current screening questions that are recommended. So the basis for the discussion is the terminology guidelines for the protection of children from sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. And the reason we need to be familiar with terminologies is because when we communicate with our patients, the children, the parents, even with government officials, professionals, volunteers, we need to use terms and concepts that are understandable and are considered respectful. There are terms that are already not recommended for use because they may be traumatizing or parang they blame the child. So there are proper terminologies. Usually, we also hear slang terms from our children, our patients, but this terminology guidelines does not include slang or catchwords. But then again, we are advised to become familiar with the terms used by children. Dati, eyeball lang, di ba? Pero ngayon, parang ang dami na nilang terms na ginagamit na mabilis din magpalit. So we need to be updated. We need to listen to them to be able to understand them. But those terms, syempre iba for every country, every region. But those terms are not included in the terminology guidelines, but we need to be also aware. So the terminology guidelines uses a color coding, which I will use to discuss the different terms. If the term is colored green, that means there is a general agreement of the meaning, and green means go. It can be used without stigmatizing and or otherwise harming the child. Pag orange, special attention should be paid to how this term is used. And then if red, we should avoid those terms. It's easy to say OSAEC every day, OSAEC, CSAM, OSAEC, but there are other terminologies related to those two terms, and we need to understand what they mean and which terms we need to avoid. So first is child sexual abuse. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the terms already, but it would be good to review, especially those that will be orange or red later. So for child sexual abuse, we understand this, it requires, when we compare it to exploitation, there's no element of exchange. And the mere purpose of the act is for the sexual gratification of the person committing the act. We also know that for child sexual abuse, it does not involve, in most cases, force or a weapon, but other softer forms of coercion like authority, power, or manipulation as determining factors. Hindi naman parating assault na may weapon or tinanga yung bata and dinala sa vacant lot. And you know that most of our cases are done by people known to the child, even by family members. And the factors that enable the abuse to occur is not really physical force, but imbalances in authority, power, and manipulation. We also know that when the child has not reached the age of sexual consent, we don't need any legal justification to establish that there was abuse. The mere fact that sexual activity taking place is sufficient to constitute abuse. So may I see lang po quickly in the chat, what is our age of consent now? Okay, thank you, ma'am. So 16. So as long as the child is less than 16, thank you, ma'am. We know that it is clearly statutory rape unless it falls under the close-in age exception of 3 years, less than 3 years. So child sexual abuse is green and gold. It is okay for us to use this term. The difference between abuse and exploitation is that there is an exchange, although there is considerable overlap. So yung exchange na yun is not always money. It can also be, and usually among our patients, attention or affection. And then these terms are also used interchangeably. And in fact, child sexual exploitation can also be considered a form of abuse. So for both these terms, they are clear and they are okay to use. Child pornography, as some of us already know, is a red term. It is usually used still because it is used in legal instruments or in international policies. It describes child sexual abuse material, and then the legal policies and documents describes the offenses related to the producing, sharing, and accessing child sexual abuse material. But there is a broad consensus among organizations, law enforcement, and child protection agencies that the term is already inappropriate and they suggest alternative terminology. The preferred term for child pornography is child sexual abuse material or child exploitation material. So you will already begin to see this lalo na in international publications, but of course under our In RA 11930, it is already CSAM. So this is increasingly used to replace the term child pornography because you is sexualized material that depicts children, real children, or represents children is a form of child sexual abuse. And we try to avoid the term pornography because when used in relation to children, it parang decreases the gravity or even normalizes and even legitimizes what is actually abuse or exploitation of children. So child pornography is still a legal term but should be avoided in other non-legal contexts. So next is the term self-generated or produced sexual content involving children. So you might hear self-generated CSAM or self-generated child sexual abuse material. There are risks involved when children produce their own content, even if it is consensual or they voluntarily did it, because it can be circulated online or even in person and can be used as a basis for extortion. There is a risk in using the term coercive or coercively produced content because it seems like we're blaming the child and for the abuse that resulted from it. So other reminders about this term is that the production and subsequent use or sharing must be clearly separated. Some policies or some papers use the term image-based sexual abuse because it is more neutral and does not imply blame on the child. Kasi parang pag sinabi mong self-generated nung bata, parang we're also blaming the child if something negative happens from that content. So you will already begin to see the term image-based sexual abuse. Sometimes when we use yung self-generated, sometimes it's also under extortion or blackmail. So if we just say self-generated, disregard yung reason behind it if the child was forced or manipulated. So we need to distinguish between content that is created by children in a consensual manner among themselves or like between older adolescents versus content involving young children. Pag older adolescents, we know that it is already a norm, part of their behavior to exchange these kinds of materials in a context of a relationship. But when the material involves younger children, there is a higher risk that the children involved are exploited. So for any sexual material involving very young children, we have to assume that it is a result of an abusive or coercive relationship with an adult or another child. And yung self-produced, pag maliit na bata, is only a perception because yun, as mentioned earlier, for small children, for younger children, it may be under manipulation or coercion. So we need to understand the context in which these sexualized materials were created, produced, and then shared, whether they were manipulated, whether they forced. So when we see a video or picture of a child, we need to consider the age and then the circumstances behind it. Kasi baka nga older adolescent and the creation and the sharing may have been or may also not be consensual. So just a reminder that any sexually suggestive or explicit image or video involving children is not production of child pornography when it is for their own private use. So I think the most important consideration here is when there is a photo or image of a child, consider the age and consider the circumstances under which it was created and then shared. So, kaya orange is because you have to be careful with the use of the term self-generated content. So, they also recommend other terms na first-person generated or self-generated produced sexual material involving children to qualify kung sino ba yung gumawa, and then later it was shared. So sexting, which we also use often, is actually an orange term. Yung sexting refers to self-production of sexual images or the exchange of sexual images or messages, and then creating, sharing, and forwarding nude or nude images through mobile phones or the internet. It can be a form of self-generated, sexually explicit content and is probably the most common form of self-generated, sexually explicit content involving children among consenting adolescents who derive pleasure from the experience. That's why the term again is a term we have to be careful with, because behind the term there are many things we need to understand. Kung anong age ba ng mga bata and under what context was the sexting done. There is also unwanted sexting, which is the non-consensual aspect of the activity, meaning the content or the image or the text was shared or received under unwanted circumstances. It may be something that was used to manipulate the child, groom the child, or in the form of bullying. So again, it can be both a consensual activity among peers, although research has also shown that girls feel pressured more than boys. Sexting can lead to abuse or exploitation, but the fact that the material is self-generated should again not result in blaming of the child for what happens or holding the child criminally liable. So we have gone through the terms child sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation, both okay to use. And then we discuss sexting, which and child pornography. So exposure to harmful content is also a term that we have to be careful with. It refers to children accessing or being exposed to intentionally or unintentionally age-inappropriate material. However, it can be sexual or non-sexual. So it is any content that causes harm to the child, which can include adult pornography and CSAM. Sometimes an adult can deliberately show harmful content to a child or watch pornography in the presence of a child. The danger with exposure to harmful content, kung unintentional naman, is it can also normalize harmful sexual behavior for children as individuals or within their peer group. So it is also not always sexual. This term encompasses violent video games or websites that encourage hate speech. So it should not be used as a synonym for CSAM or child pornography because it refers to broader content, not only sexual. So now we come to the term TFCSEA. As you can see, it's all in green because it is actually the preferred term to OSAEC. In the APSB last year, and even in our discussions, we continue to use OSAEC because it is the term familiar to the public because of RA 11930. But the terminology guidelines recommend use of the term TFCSEA. So, ang TFCSEA is preferred because it acknowledges that almost all of our child sexual abuse is already has some connection to online. It is rare that no technology at all is used at some stage in the creation, in committing, or sharing, especially of child sexual abuse material or in the sexual exploitation of children. But there are also still cases in WCPUs na walang kinalaman sa online. For example, our patients who were abused by a family member, there is no need for, unless the, for example, father or stepfather took a picture and shared online or took a picture of the child, then merong technology involved. But there are still cases where there is no involvement at all of a cell phone or a video. So TFC-SCA can cover crimes committed in both online and non-online environment. For example, TFC-SCA covers offenses in the digital environment like live streaming or the exchange of CSAM. But it can also cover sexual offenses na committed in person and then through technology, it is shared, and then technology is also used to connect to other offenders, and then they have a chat group where they exchange the photos. So that is also TFC-SCA. So it includes abuse that occurs completely online or offline and then online, or online and then offline. The child sexual abuse online actually is a term that is in orange that we have to be careful with, because we use it to refer to any form of abuse which has a link to the digital environment. But it is not a new form. We know that it is not a different form of sexual abuse. We are just saying that either it occurred online or was facilitated by the digital environment. So actually, in the guidelines, they recommend using it as a last word, child sexual abuse online, to refer to cases that happen in the online environment. So online should, according to the terminology guidelines, the word online should only be used in connection with the environment where the abuse took place, rather than saying it is a different form of abuse. Kaya gusto nila, it is at the end of the child sexual abuse online, something that happened online. So it is sexual abuse committed elsewhere and then repeated by sharing it online. But in general, the preferred term is TFC-SCA, so that it can include the cases that we see. Usually, we see cases where the child was groomed online, but the abuse happened offline. So far, okay naman po ba? Sana hindi kayo lalong naguluhan. May I have a thumbs up po if still okay? Or if you have any questions about the terms that have been discussed so far. Okay, so the term that we just went through is child sexual exploitation. Among the terms that you might hear, live online child sexual abuse is okay. Live streaming of child sexual abuse is okay. In fact, live streaming is used in RA 11930. But webcam child sex tourism or webcam child sexual abuse is no longer recommended. Although at the start, ito yung term na ginagamit sa mga study the terminology guideline says it is limiting because it is just describes the technology that is used, in particular the webcam. So the preferred term is live streaming, especially with RA 11930. So I will discuss a few more terms that may not be clear to us because this term will later appear as one of the subtypes of TFCSEA. So when we say solicitation of children for sexual purposes, solicitation is an okay term to use. Solicitation means to ask somebody for something. Parang pag nagsosolicit ng sponsorships or to try to get something or persuade someone to do something. Solicitation is used interchangeably with grooming or online grooming. So it is essentially, they both mean the solicitation of children for sexual purposes. Now, with online, with TFCSEA, it becomes complicated because there is now also in-person grooming, which we are familiar with, and then online grooming. So online solicitation or grooming is increasingly happening online for sexual purposes. And this is the form, I think, that we are most familiar with because it can lead to sexual abuse online or in person or both. Solicitation does not become bad only if it leads to offline abuse. It can be harmful to the child even if it never moves outside the online environment, because solicitation and grooming already may consist of unwanted talk, unwanted questions, sexual requests. So even if it never moves offline, it is already harmful to the child and should be recognized. At the same time, offline sexual abuse that started from online solicitation should also be, the online part of it should also be recognized as an important aspect of the offline sexual abuse. So we will see later what that means, but so solicitation and grooming can occur in person, often facilitated by ICT, for example, by phone or text contact. But it can also, as we are familiar with, it also happens offline. So online solicitation involves contacting the child. If online, it is through technology. The main purpose is to lure or incite the child, to manipulate the child, and to engage in any sexual activity by any means, whether online or in person. So it is important for us to understand this online solicitation or grooming because when we define TFCSEA, we said that it is sexual abuse that has any connection with the online environment. But we also need to qualify ano ba yung naging interaction online. Because if the phone was just used to communicate and everybody uses the phone to communicate, it does not instantly become OSAEC. We need to understand the kind of exchange or interaction, if it was really grooming that happened, for us to label it as online solicitation or grooming. So in the context of child sexual abuse and exploitation, grooming is still an acceptable term. It is the short name for solicitation of children. Again, it's the process of establishing or building a relationship with a child, either in person or through the internet, to facilitate sexual contact. It is the preparation or training or manipulation of the child for a particular purpose or activity, which in this case is sexual. Other related terms are enticement of children online, also acceptable, and sexual extortion of children. The guidelines says we should avoid sextortion, something that we also use regularly. So while sexting, if you remember, was a term that we have to be careful with, for sextortion naman, it does not show clearly that it is a matter of sexual exploitation against a child. And again, it risks trivializing a practice that can produce extremely serious consequences. So, hindi naman malayo, but I think they just want it emphasized that it is sexual extortion of children. The sextortion is also used kasi in adult contexts. So we will now proceed to the subtypes of TFCSEA. We needed that background of terminologies to understand how all of these forms are now going to be classified. So for those who were able to attend the workshop of Ako Para sa Bata in November, we had Child Light from the University of Edinburgh. Professor Fry introduced to us the 5 broad subtypes of TFCSEA. So these 5 types are based on related literature, based on studies, and based on policies and models that they found in the literature. So I will just show you the 5. There is online solicitation, which we have discussed, non-consensual taking and sharing of sexual images and videos, also known as CSAM or IBSA. CSAM is child sexual abuse material, and IBSA is image-based sexual abuse. The third is exposure to unwanted sexual content, online sexual exploitation, and then sexual extortion. Not sextortion, but sexual extortion. So I will go back to the first type. Online solicitation, what they categorized, what they included in this subgroup are in the second column. So all forms of online grooming, online solicitation, online sexual harassment, unwanted sexual talk, pressure to ask for images, like when a person pressures the child to give images, that is online solicitation. Or if a child provides images to an older person. And then unwanted or non-consensual or pressurized sexting, meaning the sending and receiving of sexual messages, images, and videos. So all of these are unwanted or pressured sexual interactions. It can range from a simple inquiry or a long-standing exchange that can lead to exchange already of pictures or videos. So it can be start with a chat and then lead to actual exchange of sexual pictures or videos, or even getting the child to expose intimate body parts or engage in a sexual act, but with no exchange or threat involved. It is just unwanted. So there are different types of online solicitation, but in their category, they acknowledge that it can happen between adult perpetrators and even between peers. So again, in this categorization, the online solicitation includes exchange between peers. So the next category, which may be confusing here, is non-consensual taking and sharing of sexual images and videos. But if you look at the right column, it's not only unwanted or pressured, but they are non-consensual because they were taken when the child was unconscious or intoxicated or distracted or unable to consent. So this might be our patients who were drunk, or who and while drunk or passed out or asleep, pictures or videos were taken of them. So hindi lang siya unwanted or pressured, talagang non-consensual. And then it includes that these images or videos are shared. So hindi lang taking but sharing via a cell phone or internet. This category also includes deep fake images where the child's head or likeness are imposed on the sexual image of somebody else. So that is the second category. The third type is exposure to unwanted sexual content. In child rights categories, they included in exposure to unwanted sexual content, even if there is no clear perpetrator, basta it's unwanted exposure. Like forcing, in cases where there is a perpetrator, it means when a child is forced to watch a nude photo or video, or when a child is sent a link to a pornographic website. So this can also happen to children when they surf the internet or when they scroll through social media. But it may or may not lead to a request by somebody for more for exchange of content. But child light included this category because it has a role as a risk factor for consequences of child sexual abuse online. It has negative consequences, and it also plays a role in further OSAEC, like when the child is later blackmailed, or when the child clicks that link, it can lead to other forms of TFCCA. So the first was online solicitation, and then non-consensual sharing or taking of images, exposure to unwanted sexual content, and then our fourth is online sexual exploitation. This is easier to understand because it is anything that involves commercial exploitation, meaning there was an exchange, monetary or non-monetary resources like food, clothing, gifts, or anything else that is valuable to the child. So it involves both talk, images, and also other activities. And live streaming falls under this category. The last group is sexual extortion. It is the form where the child is blackmailed, that if the child does not comply, an image or video will be shared or disseminated online unless they comply with demands like money or more additional pictures or even sexual activities. So it can also include sexual acts on webcam coerced by the perpetrator. If you have noticed, all of these subtypes can overlap and they can get pretty confusing. But the reason we want to understand the groups or subtypes is so that we know the extent. When we say OSAEC, it is a range of abusive behaviors. And although what we see usually in the WCPU are those that have been groomed online and then are sexually abused offline, these children may also be experiencing many other forms. So let's try to recognize these cases as to what form of OSAEC they are. So we have Anna, a 17-year-old female, accompanied by her mother to the WCPU. They want to file a case against Carlo, her 18-year-old ex-boyfriend. Anna's older sister received a sexual video of Anna and Carlo from Anna's friend. The video was taken by Carlo during a consensual sexual act. Anna was aware of the video, but she deleted it from Carlo's phone. When Anna broke up with Carlo, Carlo took the video from the trash folder and shared it without Anna's knowledge and without her consent. So among the five, what form do you think this is? Online solicitation, non-consensual sharing or taking, unwanted exposure to sexual content, exploitation, or sexual extortion? Una, is this OSAEC? Can anybody say yes, OSAEC, or thumbs up sign if you think this is OSAEC? And CPN, are you there? Thank you, ma'am. So this is OSAEC. Okay, thank you, ma'am Merle. OSAEC, but it gets confusing. No, we don't need to really decide, but just discuss the case. It is confusing kasi the image, the video, according to the child, this was my patient, she said she was aware and she is a teen. She was aware she was a teen. She agreed to the taking of the video. But then because she is 18, after she changed her mind, she regretted it, she deleted it from his phone. So, yung consent is gray because una pumayag siya and then dinelete niya. But the sharing was unwanted. The sharing was non-consensual. Okay, yes. Hi, Dr. Baldovino. Thank you. The sharing was without consent. So I agree. I think this falls under non-consensual sharing of sexual content. So the child light specifies that, I mean, all the studies specify that although the taking of the image was consensual at first, the sharing after, if non-consensual, becomes abuse. It becomes abuse. Also, this Carlo is already 18-year-old. So under our law, he has criminal liability already. Okay, so for the next case, si Migo, a 15-year-old boy, is referred by the police to WCPU, accompanied by his mother. And they want to file against the teacher or a math tutor. So Migo was invited by the teacher to his house. He recalls being offered a glass of water and then falling asleep. And then, this was also my patient, he does not want to disclose other details. That's all he wants to say. He says that he does not remember anything else. A few days after the incident, Migo heard about a viral photo in school, and the picture, they were bullying the boy in the picture. I think there was another similar case in another WCPU. So the boy, Migo, later found out from his friend that the boy in the picture was him. And they went to the police, and then the police referred to the WCPU for examination. So again, is this OSAEC? Because there is viral photo, it is easy to decide. This is TFCSCA, but as to the form, again, we don't know. Migo did not want to disclose if there was actual offline sexual abuse. Maybe he was not ready, but definitely because the teacher could have been the only source of the image and that it became viral, then this is also non-consensual taking the second category, because Migo said he fell asleep. So we don't really know the context. Maybe in a follow-up, he will change his statement. But as far as the information presented now, it would involve non-consensual taking and sharing of the image. The teacher, the math tutor here is also an adult, so he is criminally liable. So lastly, we have a 16-year-old female seen at the ER for a suicidal attempt. On psychosocial history, the pedia resident on duty, using the heads, was able to elicit that the girl also sells nude photos of herself through a secret account on Facebook. So this is again just a point for discussion, because during the review of the terminology guidelines, if you remember, self-generated content was a term that we have to be careful with because it implies blame on the child. But then again, these photos or images were used in a form of exploitation. So the child did not disclose if she had kung sino yung bumibili, or if she was already engaged with someone who buys these photos from her regularly. So although we cannot identify a perpetrator, this is a form of child online sexual exploitation. So what we also want to emphasize here is, even if we saw all of those categories, we need to understand that these categories overlap, because online abuse intersects with offline through polyvictimization, through shared risk factors, and through pathways linking offline abuse to online grooming and offline abuse. That's why even if we see only one kind of OSAEC patient regularly, those who were groomed online, because of this polyvictimization and shared risk factors, it becomes important for the WCPUs to be able to identify, screen, or recognize other forms of TFCSEA that the child may be involved with. The interventions and the prevention are different. So as frontliners, we need to be part of that, recognizing these TFCSEA. In fact, a larger proportion of children experience both online and in-person sexual abuse than those who experience online child sexual abuse only. So that means the patients we see, there is a high likelihood that they are experiencing online. This is according to the Disrupting Harm study. So we also need to be mindful that these subtypes co-occur. We went through the exercise of recognizing what subtype it is, but that is only an exercise so we can recognize. But we know that online sexual solicitation and grooming can lead to the production of sexual images. If the offender asks the child to produce an image or request, and then that can lead to non-consensual misuse of the sexual image, which can later lead to sexual extortion. The online solicitation can also progress to live streaming if the child has been groomed enough. And also, as we are familiar with offline sexual abuse, victims of online grooming can also become victims of sextortion when their offenders use sexual content obtained from the victim to control them. So there are many studies that document these co-occurrences. CSAM and live streaming may be elicited through grooming, and they overlap when offenders request or receive images outside the live stream, or when offenders record the live stream and create CSAM. So these categories are not exclusive or separate from each other. Lastly, non-consensual sexting and sexual extortion can overlap with sexual solicitation and live streaming when the images that are produced upon request become involved in the illegal exchange or in the trading already of CSAM. That is why si Mamrel is here. We were discussing sharing thing also earlier because the overposting or oversharing of parents using public accounts, those images, although innocently shared, can later on be used for deepfakes or end up in the trade of CSAM. So I just included here a short discussion on grooming because this is the form that we usually see. And though we emphasize that TFCSEA is anything that involves a connection to the online environment, Ma'am Bernie was emphasizing yesterday that not any use of the cell phone is already OSAEC. So we need to understand the context of the interaction of the online grooming. So there are also differences between physical and online grooming. We are familiar with physical grooming. Just to review, we know that it involves stages such as victim selection based on vulnerability of the child, access of the abuser, and attraction of the abuser to the victim. They target vulnerable families like children from single parent families or those who have limited supervision. And then we know that in physical grooming, the offender gains access to the victim with the aim of isolating them. If it is from a family member, they create a special relationship with the child, or they go to the child's bedroom, or they assist the child with like a bath. If it is somebody outside the family, we know they try to gain the trust of the family, or they gain access to environments where they can care for the child, like yung ating mga school perpetrators or yung mga coach. And then the third stage is gaining the trust of the child. They are very skilled at showing interest in the child's concerns, showering them with gifts, and sharing secrets so that they can gain the trust of the child. And then the fourth stage of physical grooming is when they are desensitized to physical contact, like when they begin to accidentally put their arm around the child or innocently touch the child, or create activities where there is an opportunity for physical contact with a child that is innocent, like sleeping over or going for an out-of-town trip and swimming. These are justified but progressive stages of nudity that normalize the adult-child interaction. And then the last stage is a post-abuse maintenance, where the goal is to prevent disclosure and encourage the child to maintain secrecy. In online, this is not, the grooming takes a different pattern. So what is overlapping in the models that the studies show is that there is still an initial contact, there is trust development, the offender profiles the child, and then desensitizes not through physical contact, but through content, through talk, requests, questions, pictures, and videos. And then finally, isolating the child, and then forcing, blackmailing, or exploiting. So these offenders perceive the online environment as a facilitator environment. They are there to groom and abuse the child. So the pattern of online grooming is the relationship building phase. Here, the abuser synchronizes his behavior with the victim, or establishes an emotional relationship and trust with the child by identifying, similar to physical grooming, identifying with the child. But this is easier because they cannot see the offender. It is easier because they are able to hide their identities, and it is through text. So one of the common strategies used by online offenders is to compliment or praise the child. Flattery is the most common strategy that is used. They also, again, show interest in the preferences, and then they sometimes, if the child is vulnerable, they present themselves as the child's rescuer. They make the child feel special and they isolate them. So the next stage common to the models of online grooming is now the introduction of sexual content. So this would be parallel to the desensitizing stage in physical grooming. Dito, they begin to have sexualized online communication through flirting or starting to share photos, sexual photographs, or initiating dirty talk. That this part is what also can overlap with other forms later, because the transmission of photos or videos can become grounds for subsequent blackmail. And then the third stage for online grooming would be assessment of the child's environment. So even if they are online, the perpetrators conduct a risk assessment to assess the level of trust and vulnerability of the child, and including the risk of discovery of the interaction. So this is a thematic map that will help us understand what goes on in online grooming, online solicitation. So it is not merely like texting the child, or for example, if you have a perpetrator and the child who know each other already and are neighbors, and then of course they will text because that's the most common form of communication now. But what qualifies as online solicitation or online grooming is the interaction itself. So on the left side, you have strategies employed by perpetrators to overcome victim resistance. And then on the right side, you have strategies used by the victim to resist, de-escalate, and end their abuse. So it is this kind of interaction online that would qualify as beginning grooming, online grooming, or solicitation. So on the right side, we'll start with the offender strategies. They try to isolate the victim. They deprive the victim of sleep. They pretend to be, and then the lowering of inhibitions includes pretending to be playing or joking, or pretending to be getting to know the victim, and then initiating the exchange of photos. And then it can escalate when the perpetrator begins to reveal his true colors. It can escalate to a threat, a pressure, emotional manipulation, and eventually blackmail. On the other hand, the victim's resistance strategies can include leaving the platform. So I think one of the red flags would be when a perpetrator tries to ask the victim to move to another platform. That is a red flag. So the victim can also block the perpetrator, delete the contact of the perpetrator, try to end the relationship. They pretend to misinterpret what the perpetrator is trying to do. They avoid and they invoke guilt. And then other strategies include directly refusing to comply, providing excuses, questioning the perpetrator's request, and use of prior knowledge of internet safety. So these are just, I'm just sharing this to show the kind of interaction that takes place online so that we can qualify if there is an attempt for online solicitation in grooming. So lastly, our current protocol, we follow the Dutch scenario model, which integrates investigation of child sexual abuse and use of developmentally appropriate questions. Because this model, our protocol, was developed in the early 2000s, it is not yet updated to include this extent of TFC-SCA as we have discussed this morning. If you will notice, the questions refer to the TV, the radio, pictures, book, magazine, but we already have questions here because these questions were specific to child pornography at that time. So did the offender take any pictures, videos? What did he take pictures of? And our CPMIS already has this under acts described. So it's not new to us to ask about the use of technology, except that we have to update and be aware of the range of abusive behaviors that are involved in TFCSEA. There are some screening questions. We presented this during the workshop last year. Very basic. Have you ever been asked to send or share photos of yourself? Has anyone ever sent you a nude or indecent picture or video online? Has anyone ever threatened you online? These are recommended screening questions to begin the conversation. We are also looking at more specific questions from studies that we can use as follow-up questions to determine the exact form of the FCSEA, but we are not yet, these questions, as mentioned during the workshop last year, we have to develop them and then present back to the WCPUs. We need to decide if they are developmentally appropriate and they are appropriate for a forensic interview because they have to be non-leading also. But what we have to keep in mind is that when we see a WCPU patient, the patient can be presenting with offline child sexual abuse only, or they may be patients with offline but with a disclosure or evidence of OSAEC. And then what we need to be look out for are those patients who have undisclosed OSAEC. We need to train our residents to be aware. For example, there are a resident at the ER who was able to elicit that the child was being exploited just using the heads interview. And then eventually, because of the new protocol, we might receive patients who are being referred only for mental health interventions for a disclosure or evidence of OSAEC only. So this is a work in progress, but I was trying to summarize the forms to a simpler form table for us to remember. So one of the most important things we need to know is what was the relationship of the child to the perpetrator. If the child says boyfriend, we know that we need to ask a follow-up question, how did you meet? Because there is a possibility that the child was groomed online. And then sexual communication, like talk through talk or questions or requests, and then pictures, the asking or receiving of pictures or videos that are unwanted are part of online solicitation. The taking, sharing of pictures that are non-consensual is CISA and IBSAA. And then unwanted exposure, this is not actually criminalized, but is a risk factor and part of overlaps with other forms. And then what is clearer is the talk, picture, videos, acts involving exchanges, exploitation, and involving threat is a sexual extortion. Okay, so I hope I did not confuse you more. We can make the presentation available, but the terminology guidelines are also downloadable for free from the internet. And that's all. Thank you.